everybody, Keep7 here, back with another Magic the Gathering Arena video, and today we're going over the standard and historic metagame breakdowns for the upcoming Zendikar Rising Championship. Just going to talk mostly about the standard metagame, as I don't know too much about the historic metagame. I've been playing a lot more historic recently, but I just don't think that I have enough experience in the historic format to really give an in-depth commentary onto the picks and what it means as far as their meta share, the percentage of the field that they're taking up. So to begin, we'll start with the metagame breakdown. I'll throw it up on the screen so everybody can follow along, but we have Gruul Adventures with 44 decks registered, representing 23.9% of the field. Then we have Mono Green Food with 32 decks registered, representing 17.4% of the field. Damir Rogues at 31 decks, representing 16.8% of the field. Temur Adventures, 20 decks, 10.9% of the field. Damir Control, 19 decks, 10.3% of the field. Esper Doom Foretold with 17 decks, 9.2% of the field. And then Mardu Doom Foretold with 4 decks and 2.2% of the field. And then we do have the other category, which obviously you can't really speak to what those decks are, but 17 other decks were registered, representing 9.2% of the field. So one thing that you will notice is it is a lot more of a healthy breakdown. You know, none of these percentages are higher than 50%, which is something that we've been seeing, fairly recently. You know, we saw a lot of decks be, far and away better than any other deck in the format, and not every single, but a lot of pros were playing pretty much only that deck, which makes sense. I mean, if it's the best deck in the format, why would you play anything else? And it's nice to see none of these numbers above a ridiculously high percentage. Above 50% is great, and seeing everything below 25% is amazing. It means I think that we have a healthy format on our hands, and I think that's what everybody's been realizing about Standard recently. So to kind of get into the decks, Gruul taking up, and I'm just rounding here, but Gruul at 24% I think is an interesting take. I'm surprised that many people are actually willing to play Gruul, considering Mono Green Food has gotten so popular, and Mono Green actually has a favorable matchup against Gruul. I guess it makes sense, though, because Gruul is the deck to beat, and it is a very formidable deck. On the play, it really does not have a lot of bad matchups. So Gruul being the deck to beat, I guess it makes sense. I am surprised the number is higher. I thought maybe Mono Green Food might clinch the top spot. But I guess if Mono Green clinches the top spot, another deck will take its place. So I guess it does make sense that Gruul takes the top spot and Mono Green is a close second. So Gruul is the deck to beat. As far as its classification, I mean, it's called Gruul Adventures on the Metagame Breakdown, but I struggle to kind of define the deck. Is it aggro? Is it mid-range? Because sometimes it plays out like a mid-range deck, but sometimes it feels like an aggro deck. So it's kind of somewhere in between, maybe. I mean, early on, I think some players weren't playing in the earlier days that the deck was being played. I didn't see a lot of Brushfire Elemental, and now recently, and in recent tournaments, I think in even the Omnath tournament when it was being played, Brushfire Elemental is an inclusion in the deck, and I think that actually kind of pushes it more towards the aggro approach. When it wasn't included, it played like a mid-range deck, and now that it is included, and I think Questing Beast is included in the sideboard, I think that does kind of push it more into the aggro category. Kind of has like a aggro landfall, with Kazandu Mammoth, with Brushfire Elemental, Lovestruck Beast, and I mean obviously Embercleave, but I've heard it said that Embercleave makes any deck an aggro deck, which I don't necessarily believe, because I think Embercleave, it also kind of works in a mid-range format where it's just a massive threat that you have to remove, which is kind of the definition of mid-range, is deploying threats slowly, one at a time, but they're massive threats that demand an answer. So, aggro, mid-range. I think post-sideboard, it clearly becomes a mid-range deck, and then maybe pre-sideboard, you can call it aggro, but regardless, it's the Gruul Adventures deck everybody knows and loves. Card advantage engines like Edgewall Inkeep will keep cards coming into your hand. Some decks might play a 50-50 split of Embercleave, and I've seen Great Henge included in that deck, but I think Embercleave is probably going to be the choice finisher for those decks. So next at 17%, we have Mono Green Food, which I was expecting. It's a deck that surged in popularity a few weeks ago and then kind of dipped in popularity, I think, because people didn't really figure out what the right card combinations were. But I think after a lot of tuning, it's become popular again, and I think people realize that it has a really favorable matchup against Gruul Adventures, which is why it is so popular. It is a great deck to fight against the Gruul Adventure deck. So, mono green food taking up 17%, I think makes sense to me. Its matchups against a lot of the other decks, I think, also kind of make a case for it being the number 2 deck. It's 50-50 against Rogues. I think, you could argue Rogues milling a Feasting Troll King early is great, but, would make it favored against Rogues, but I kind of disagree. Making 3 foods is actually more difficult than you would expect without a Feasting Troll King. But you have card advantage engines early like Trail of Crumbs, and then card advantage engines late like a Great Henge if it resolves. But it's a great deck. I think it has a lot of good matchups. In the Doom Foretold matchup, you have things like Witch's Oven to protect your Feasting Troll Kings from exile and stuff like that. So I think on paper, mono green food looks bad against the Esper, Yorion, Doom Foretold decks, or any of the Doom Foretold decks. But I think it actually has a pretty good matchup against those decks, and a 50-50 matchup against Damir Rogues. So it has decent matchups against a lot of the decks out there. I think its only predator out there right now is Temur Adventures, and I think Temur Adventures is surging in popularity. We'll talk about that deck later, but I think Temur Adventures is surging in popularity because of the prevalence of mono green food. I think Temur Adventures surged in popularity on the ladder, on the competitive Magic Arena ladder, because mono green food is so popular. So, Temur Adventures players were cashing in easy wins against that deck. Seeing it pop up here is pretty surprising. Again, we'll get into that later. But anyway, next we have Damir Rogues at 16.8%. There's not a lot to say about Rogues. It's been around for a long time. Obviously, we saw Seth Manfield playing the Lurrus version of it early, much earlier than a lot of other people. 2 weeks after I think I made my video on Damir Rogues. Just heads up to everybody. But yeah, it's a deck that's been around for a long time. Everybody knows it. I think it has kind of a 50-50 matchup against almost every deck in the format. It's just one of those decks that is just kind of a 50% win rate deck. It's a deck that either you get in there and you deploy some early threats, and again, all of what I'm about to say is dependent on the kind of deck that Damir Rogues is playing. Is it the Control Rogues where it's just all instant speeds, or is it the Lurrus Rogues, or but it's a deck that either form of it has kind of a maybe either. The Lurrus Rogues has a deploy early and cheap threats fast, and then counter all follow-up spells and stuff like that, and try to control things that might get in the way of your small, your Thieves Guild Enforcer and Soaring Thought Thief and blah blah blah. So that deck kind of comes out fast and then tries to control the mid to late game, and sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. And it's all about card advantage. You have card advantage engines or ways to refill your hand, things like Into the Story. So it's just a very powerful deck, but really depends on your draw. So I think it really has kind of a 50-50 matchup against most of these decks, to be honest. So you know it, you love it, or hate it. I hate it, but that's Damir Rogues. Next is Temur Adventures. Temur Adventures at 11%, which was a little bit surprising to me. I really didn't expect to see it. I expected it to maybe be, more towards the bottom. Maybe a few people would register this deck, but it looks like a lot of people are really kind of cashing in and really kind of hopping on the bandwagon. This deck really is a predator to mono green food, and I think it kind of is. Gruul I think has a favorable matchup against it, and I think Gruul could farm Temur Adventures because Temur Adventures develop so slowly. But Temur Adventures it goes over the top, and it's so when it goes off, and it just has so many powerful spells that it's hard to imagine that it has mono green food, Damir Rogues. I think it can absolutely crush those decks. Gruul Adventures makes sense that Gruul Adventures is its predator. So if it's the predator to mono green food, if Temur Adventures is mono green food's predator, then Gruul Adventures is Temur Adventures predator. This is a lot of so I'll just say Gruul and Temur because we know now. So if Temur is mono green's predator, Gruul is Temur's predator, which I guess makes sense. It's the rocks paper scissors of a healthy Magic format. So it's cool. It's cool to see this all kind of developing. Next, we have Damir Control at 10.3%. Damir Control, I think, is a predator for Teamer Adventures. So we have this is a deck that I haven't been seeing too much of. I can't really speak to that much, but I can tell you Extinction Event is the natural enemy of Teamer Adventures. Considering all of their threats are odd, and one of their win conditions is deploying an Obosh and having all their odd creatures explode and do a bunch of damage. Extinction Event will just wipe everything out. Well-timed Extinction Events can just be an end-all be-all, but I mean, the Teamer Adventures does have a backup plan of Genesis Ultimatum, which is just an incredible card in that deck. But Damir Control, I think, really matches up well against Teamer Adventures. So Damir Control, I think, just gets crushed by Gruul. Mono Green, I've never really seen those two go head to head. I haven't seen much Damir Control, so I don't really know what the decks are going to look like. I don't know if we can look at players' decks yet. I haven't seen if the registered decks have been published yet. I'm just looking at the metagame breakdowns that were just released. So, without seeing the deck lists, I don't really know. Right here, we can see that it has Maze Mind, Home, Neutralize, and Extinction Event. But without seeing, I'm assuming it's going to be like Ashiok, maybe Ugin. Counter spells and removal, cheap counter spells, cheap removal, and card draw engines like Maze Mind Tome, Extinction Event as board wipe, and stuff like that. So, tough to say. And then the bottom two decks we can kind of speak at the same time. They're both Doom Foretold decks. It's the Yorion big explosion value turn, and Doom Foretold to kind of thwart or delay your enemy's plan as much as possible. I don't expect these decks to perform very well. If one is going to come out on top, it's going to be the Esper version. I don't think the Mardu Doom Foretold deck is cool, and I think it was a great idea, and it's really interesting, and it's definitely an interesting deck list. But if any of these decks are going to do well, it's going to be the Esper Doom Foretold deck. But post sideboard, I think Gruul will eat it up. I think Mono Green will eat that up, and Damir Rogues potentially could really, could destroy it. And Teamer Adventures goes over the top really, really well. Even if a Doom Foretold is sacrificing everything that you're playing every turn, you just cast a Genesis Ultimatum and then fill the field with like a bunch of creatures. I mean, if you can get that far. Again, I haven't seen the deck list, so I'm not sure. Esper, Doom Foretold, a lot of those decks weren't running counter spells initially, but they probably do post sideboard. If they're playing counter spells main deck, I think they're favored against Teamer Adventures. If they're playing them in the sideboard, obviously that then I think game one Teamer Adventures is favored, and then at post sideboard, it could be like a 50-50, or maybe Doom Foretold. The Doom Foretold decks are favored, but obviously the Mardu Doom Foretold deck I don't think is going to perform very well. It's going to need counter spells to prevent things like Genesis Ultimatum from resolving. It'll be tough. Mardu Doom Foretold could really, with all the board wipe that they probably play, could really kind of disrupt Gruul Adventures' plan. Mono Green Food has things to keep their Troll King safe from exile and have ways to kind of protect their creatures. A Wicked Wolf is indestructible. So it's tough to say. I don't really know what the Mardu Doom Foretold is running as far as board wipe. I'm assuming this is like the Ruinous Ultimatum version. But again, Wicked Wolf is indestructible. There are ways to protect a lot of the things in the Mono Green Food deck. Damir Rogues has counter spells. So those decks, although impressive and can really have some very value generating turns, I just don't see performing that well. And that's why I think we see them at the bottom. And then as far as other decks, obviously, I have no idea what they could be. But that's generally, I'd say, so we have some control decks, we have some aggro decks, mid-range decks. The only thing we're seeing here that's absent is any sort of like combo deck, which is interesting. I guess you could say Teamer Adventures is kind of a combo deck with Genesis Ultimatum and like Terror of the Peaks and Beanstalk Giant. I guess that's kind of a combo. You could also say it's mid-range. I don't know. So like combo mid-range, and like Damir Rogues is kind of like aggro control or control, depending on which version is being played. But yeah, it's healthy. I mean, you got a lot of different decks here, and none of them are really an kind of a disgusting portion of the field. Nothing is taking up more than 25%, which is awesome. Or I guess in this case 24. Yeah, and nothing is higher than 24%, which is great. So we have a healthy standard format on our hands, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this all plays out. I think Teamer Adventures is going to kind of be your dark horse. And then I think it's going to be really interesting to see how games play out between like Mono Green and Damir Rogues, how Damir Control keeps up with, those top tier decks, especially, how is Damir Control going to keep Gruul under control, stuff like that. And then the Doom Foretold decks, we'll see. I mean, I'm interested to see who's playing Mardu Doom Foretold. I haven't looked up who's playing, who are going to be playing those decks, but it's interesting to see that 4 of them are registered and see how they perform. All right, moving on to the historic metagame. So I'll basically just kind of break it down as the deck type or archetype, same thing that you'll see on the screen, archetype, deck count, and percent of the field. So we have Rakdos and Jund Sacrifice, 56 decks registered, 30.4% of the field. Sultai and 4-color midrange, 52 decks at 28.3% of the field. Goblins with 23 decks registered, 12.5% of the field. Azorius Auras, 12 decks registered, 6.5% of the field. Azorius Control, 9 decks registered, 6.5. Azorius Control, 9 decks registered, 4.9% of the field. Colorless Ramp, 5 decks, 2.7% of the field. Damir Control, 4 decks registered, 2.2% of the field. And then other 23 at 12.5% of the field. I don't play, I'm playing Historic more, but I don't play it enough where I really think I can give an in-depth breakdown of all these decks the way I could for the standard metagame. The one thing that's surprising to me is the prevalence of Rakdos and Jund Sacrifice. At 30%, that's, I did not expect, I expected it to be on this list. I did not expect it to be the number 1 deck on this list. I expected like Sultai and maybe, I guess Goblins. I expected them to be pretty high up. I did not expect Rakdos to be number 1. I expected it to be much lower. I thought it would be like 3rd, 4th, maybe even 5th deck. It's a deck I haven't been seeing on the ladder a lot. I haven't been seeing people talking about it really. Maybe I'm looking in the wrong places. I've been seeing people talk about Bant midrange, Sultai midrange, this 4-color midrange deck. I've been seeing a lot of that. I've been seeing a lot of people talk about Goblins. I have not been seeing people talk about. Obviously I see people talk about it. I see Croaky's posted that he was playing it recently. People post about it, but nobody's like talking about it in a way saying, "Oh, this is like a top tier deck" or like anything like that. It is, but I guess it's a deck that's just always been strong, and people are still playing, but nobody's really talking about how it's still so good. I guess people were. I guess really the problem was it didn't really get anything from Kaladesh Remastered. It got like maybe a few pieces, Fatal Push, but it didn't really get anything. And so like I think people were like really excited about all the other decks that got stuff. So everybody's talking about how popular they were and how much fun it is to play those. I guess Goblins didn't really get anything. I guess you could add Fatal Push to Goblins if you want. If you're sprinkling black for Thoughtseize, you could also sprinkle for Fatal Push, I guess. Azorius Auras obviously got a lot from, got SRAM. Just trying to think, like, Damir Control gets Fatal Push, and Torrential Gear Hulk. That makes sense. The Colorless Ramp, I guess, probably got a lot of artifacts. So, I guess Rakdos taking the number 1 spot it was just surprising to me. I just haven't been seeing a lot of buzz. It could be because nothing came out in Kaladesh to really boost the deck, but that doesn't mean it's any worse. I think it's obviously still strong enough for 56 decks to get registered and for 30% of the field to be represented by it. And then in the number 2 spot, Sultai 4-color midrange. So, these are your Uro kind of, your Uro, like churning, growth spiral, fast ramp into Nissa type decks. And again, I haven't seen the decks that have been registered. I don't know the cards that are being played in these decks, but I'm imagining like for Sultai, It's tough to say because Sultai in Historic has been kind of a little bit of a fork in the road recently, where players are either playing the like leaning into Narset and like interactability, or people are still doing the old like Hydroid Krasis into Nissa and stuff like that. So it's kind of like I don't know who's playing what or if it's split that way. And then 4-color mid-range, I think sprinkles white, and it's for Yasharn mostly. And Yasharn obviously will just shut down Rakdos Sacrifice. There's also probably a few other things you can include in white. Teferi, Wrath of God, if you splash white. So there are things you can include in 4-color mid-range. Splashing for white that I think improve the deck. I think 4-colored I think is probably a little bit stronger than Sultai. And it really depends. I think if Sultai leans on the Nissa Hydroid Krasis plan, I actually think that's a little bit weaker. I think Sultai should really start gravitating towards like the Narset interactability kind of plan. I was watching Michael Jacobs stream a little while ago, and he was saying, he was talking about that, and it made a lot of sense to me. So, I mean, that's all I really have to say about Sultai and 4-color mid-range. I mean, Uro is reason enough to play Sultai, and I mean that card is just so good. And it's I think that card is alone so good that it puts Sultai in 4-color mid-range into the number 2 spot. Goblins takes up the number 3 spot. It must be good. I crafted all the cards and I played it, and I got fucking destroyed with this deck. I hate Goblins and it hates me. I played Muxus. I played Muxus like in two separate games. I played a Muxus and got nothing. And I never see that happen to anybody. Anytime Muxus is resolved against me, it's the same thing with Ugin. Muxus is resolved against me, and he draws out all the goblins he needs. He draws out all the ones that give him haste, all the ones that pump him, and stuff like that, and destroys me and attacks for 20 on at instance or at haste speed or whatever. He resolves Muxus and attacks for 20. And there's nothing I can do. And then when I play Muxus, I get like a Goblin Matron or like a fucking Skirk Prospector, and that's it. And that's all I get. And there's an empty field. Same thing with Ugin. Like when I resolve an Ugin, I wipe the board. They can immediately like recover from it. And then anytime Ugin is resolved against me, they wipe the board, and I have nothing in my hand. I just have nothing but dead cards in my hand, and there's no way I can recoup. So Goblins is a deck that, I mean, it was popular in the last tournament that I remember watching. I think it was like the one. I don't think it was the Omnath tournament. Was there one between those two? Either way, it's been Goblins has been popular for a while, and it is a very strong deck. So we're seeing it in the number 3 spot here. All these decks at the bottom, I've been playing Azorius Auras on the ladder. Azorius Auras is a very good deck. Very hard to keep up with. You have things like Luris to recur, all of your auras and your small creatures. You have All Seed of Life's Bounty to protect stuff. Core Spirit Dancer is obviously an incredibly powerful card. It's just play cheap creatures, get them pumped up real fast, and attack for a lot. Yeah, it's a strong deck. I can't really speak up to the matchups here because I just started playing Historic recently, so I'm not too familiar with all this. And then at the bottom you got like Azorius Control, Colorless Ramp, and Damir Control. Azorius, man, I just don't see, like, I don't know how Azorius Control keeps it, like, if a Nissa is resolved, like, what does the Teferi do, like, I don't see how, you really have to play Azorius Control well. You really have to know what you're doing, you really have to know your opponent's decks, and you really have to know what you're going to counter, when you're going to counter it, when you're going to Wrath. I just don't know how it keeps up. I mean, I guess it's good against Goblins. Maybe, yeah, like you can counter the Muxus and you can Wrath of God their board early. But man, I just don't know how it keeps up. Colorless Ramp is like, I've played against that deck. I haven't played with it. I don't have the wild cards to make all the mythics and stuff required for it. But man, oh man, is that a fun deck to, like, even playing against it, watching it go off is just a treat. Because that deck can really get powerful. So it's cool to see it registered here. I'll be interested to watch those games. It's using like Forsaken Monument to pump your Solemn Simulacrums from a 2/2 to a 4/4, and I'm wondering if these are the ones using like Paradox Engine and stuff, and you can use Karn to like fetch like all the perfect artifacts that you need. Karn is like your kind of like a Fae of Wishes, just access to a wish board, and you can just like whatever the perfect card you need is in the moment, you can go fetch it. And then they have Ugin obviously to wipe the board, and you have a bunch of colorless stuff, so your board will be intact and you can destroy your opponent's board. So cool to see colorless ramp being registered, and it'll be cool to see who's playing it and what they're playing, and it'll be cool to watch those matchups in those games. And then lastly, Damir Control. Torrential Gear Hulk is a very good card. I think that this deck kind of relies on the kind of the combo of Torrential Gear Hulk getting an instant back from your graveyard to be played at instant speed. So you leave 6 mana open on your opponent's turn, you play Torrential Gear Hulk, and you can use a Sublime Epiphany, so it's like 12 mana worth of mana for 6 mana at instant speed. You get a 5/6, and you can like counter a spell, bounce a creature, draw a card, and all that. So it's like a 12 mana combo, technically. Well, it's a 12 mana combo for 6 mana, and you have a 5/6 on the field at the end of it, which is pretty awesome. But how often are you going to have a Sublime Epiphany in the graveyard? I mean, I don't know. I just don't see Dimir Control is at the bottom of the list, and I think it's for a reason. It'd be cool to see Dimir Control do well, but I don't know. I don't see it performing very well. But yeah, I mean, not much else to say. Again, I'm somewhat new to Historic, so I don't know all the matchups that well, so I wasn't really able to give you an in-depth stuff, about each matchup and all that. But it's again, 30% and lower. No deck went above 30%, so that's good. It means that Historic's in a pretty good place too. You got mid-range, you got aggro. I'd say Rakdos and Jund Sacrifice are more aggressive decks. I'd say that they're aggro decks. Goblins being kind of like a combo deck. Azorius Aura's aggro, and then we have 2 control decks and a ramp deck. I mean, that's another sign of a fairly healthy format, I'd say. The only broken card I think that's present is Uro, and even that deck only has a 28% percentage, representation of the field. So, yeah, looks pretty good. So I'm excited to see. I think the Zendikar Rising Championships are going to be really, really fun to watch. I think I'm really excited to watch this. Unlike when Omnath was a problem, and we were you were just watching Omnath ramp versus you were watching like 4-color adventure Omnath versus Omnath ramp, like watching those matchups, and then it was just what a boring thing to watch. And then I think the last tournament I watched had a bunch of rogues and stuff in it, which was better to watch. It was more fun. But this, I think, has one of the most diverse lists since I've started playing back in November 2019, November of last year. Well, this is one of the most diverse fields I've seen. So I'm really excited. I think we're really in for a treat. I think a lot of these games are going to be really fun to watch, and I hope I'm right. And I think I will be. So, really excited for it. And yeah, who will you be rooting for? What decks do you think are going to perform well? I'll tell you right now. So I think Temur, and I guess I'll go over what my expectations are, or maybe what I think is going to go down. I think Mono Green Food might come out on top for Standard. I think Temur Adventures is kind of a dark horse and might actually outperform. I think Temur Adventures potentially, won't win it per se, but I think it'll outperform people's expectations, and I think Mono Green Food will come out on top. And then as far as Historic, I'd see Sultai, honestly. If I had to, I've played Sultai the most, so maybe I'm biased, or not Sultai, I've played Bant, honestly, but I know how powerful Sultai is with like Thoughtseize and how powerful black is as a color and what they splash for. So Sultai in 4-color midrange, I think, is probably the best deck, and I think will probably perform the best. And I think it's really contributed to, is really attributed to Uro. I mean, it's just it is a broken card. That's why it's not playable in standard, and I think it's why it's Sultai and 4-color midrange are so powerful. I think a deck that's powered by Uro is a formidable deck, regardless of what you have in it. So yeah, those are my expectations. So Mono Green Food come out on top. Teamer Adventures maybe outperforms people's expectations. Sultai and 4-color midrange I think will be on top in Historic. What decks? And then I would really like to see Colorless Ramp do something, because I really like that deck. I really like watching, like even playing against it, just watching that deck go off is awesome. It's frustrating obviously when they resolve an Ugin and watching yourself slowly lose sometimes, but it's just a very cool deck. I like it a lot. I think it's kind of like a, I don't know, I have a soft spot in my heart for that one, even though I don't have it myself and don't have the wild cards for it. I'd like to see it perform. So yeah, that's it. That's I think the deck I think the tournament starts tomorrow, the 4th, and is being played through the 6th. So let me know what you guys think. Who do you think is going to win? What decks do you think perform well? What decks do you think don't perform well? What are you looking forward to watching? And yeah, thanks so much for watching. Catch you in the next one.